7,000 targets. Let that number sink in for just a moment. Not 7, not 70, not even 700, 7,000. That is the number President Donald Trump stood before the cameras and said, out loud, with full confidence, the United States military has struck inside Iran in just 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And if you think that number alone is staggering, wait until you hear everything else he said, because the Strait of Hormuz is in crisis. Oil prices are at a 4-year high. World leaders are being put on notice. And somewhere in Tehran, nobody, not even the President of the United States, knows for certain who is actually in charge. This is Rechel Meddow News. Stay with me, because what just happened in front of those cameras is one of the most jaw-dropping press conferences of this entire conflict, and you need to know every single word. It was a Monday, the kind of Monday that started with a Kennedy Center board meeting on the schedule, a routine appearance, a photo opportunity, the kind of event that usually generates polite applause and a few headlines about renovation plans. But before President Trump walked into that room, he stopped. He took questions, and what followed was anything but routine. Standing before reporters, the President of the United States delivered what can only be described as a wartime briefing, raw, unfiltered, and packed with numbers and claims that are still reverberating around the world tonight. We are now in the 3rd week of active U.S. military engagement with Iran. 3 weeks that have reshaped the Middle East, rattled global energy markets, and forced every major world power to pick a side or face the consequences. And Trump? He was not holding back. Let's start with the headline number, because 7,000 is not just a statistic, it is a statement. Trump said, and I want you to hear this clearly, that the United States military has struck more than 7,000 targets across Iran since this conflict began. 7,000. Now, to put that in perspective, the entire U.S. air campaign in the opening weeks of the Iraq War in 2003, one of the most intense military operations in modern American history, involved thousands of strikes over a longer period. Trump is claiming they have exceeded that pace, compressed into 3 weeks, against a country 3 times the size of Iraq. Military analysts are going to be debating the specifics of that number for months. But here's what we know from the president's own words, and from the evidence already visible on the ground. He said Iran's Air Force is gone. He said Iran's Navy is gone. He said that ballistic missile launches from Iran have dropped by 90%. Drone attacks? Down 95%. Think about what that means in real terms. At the start of this conflict, Iran was one of the most heavily armed nations in the region. They had an air force. They had a naval fleet. They had one of the most sophisticated drone and missile programs on the planet. A program that had alarmed U.S. defense officials for years. A program that had launched strikes on Israel, on Saudi Arabia, on American bases across the Middle East. According to President Trump, standing in front of those cameras on Monday, that program is now functionally gone. Gone. Now, is that true? Is that accurate? Can those numbers be independently verified? That is the critical question. And the honest answer is, not yet. Iran's communications infrastructure has been severely degraded. Independent journalists cannot freely operate inside the country. Satellite imagery confirms massive destruction in key military and industrial zones. But the full picture? That is still emerging. What we can say is this: the scale of what Trump described is unlike anything a sitting U.S. president has claimed in decades. And the world is paying very, very close attention. But here is the moment in that press conference that I keep coming back to, the moment that, frankly, sent a chill down my spine. A reporter asked Trump about Iran's response to the initial strikes, and Trump, the President of the United States, said something extraordinary. He said they were shocked. His exact words? "Nobody expected that. We were shocked." What was he referring to? When the U.S. and Israel launched their opening airstrikes against Iran, the expectation, the military planning, the intelligence assessments, was that Iran would retaliate against its attackers, against American forces, against Israel. That is not what happened. Instead, Iran turned its weapons on its neighbors, on the Gulf states, on Qatar, on Saudi Arabia, on the United Arab Emirates, on Bahrain, on Kuwait. Countries that, in many cases, had long-standing, if complicated, relationships with Iran. Countries that had walked a careful diplomatic tightrope for years, trying not to anger Tehran while also hosting American military bases. Iran hit them anyway. And according to Trump, the U.S. military did not fully anticipate that move. Let that sink in. The most powerful military in the world, with the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on the planet, was surprised. That single admission may be the most important thing Donald Trump said on Monday. Not the 7,000 targets, not the destroyed ships. The word shocked. Because it tells us something critical about this conflict. It is not going according to any pre-written script. This is a war with unpredictable actors, unpredictable decisions, and unpredictable consequences. And we are still in the middle of it. Now let's talk about the story that is going to affect every single person watching this video. Not just Americans, not just people in the Middle East. Every person on this planet who uses energy, buys food, fills up their car, pays an electricity bill. The Strait of Hormuz. For those who need a quick geography reminder, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most strategically critical choke points on Earth. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that strait every single day, or at least it used to. Trump confirmed on Monday that Iran had been actively attempting to mine the strait, laying explosive devices in the water to sink oil tankers and block passage. He said the U.S. military has destroyed all 30 of Iran's mine-laying ships. They're all at the bottom of the sea, he said. But here is the brutal reality. The damage is already done. Daily oil exports from the Middle Eastern Gulf have dropped by at least 60%. Crude oil prices have surged to their highest level in 4 years. Roughly 15 million barrels of crude oil and 5 million barrels of oil products have been cut off from global markets every single day this crisis has continued. Every single day. That is not an abstract number. That is your gas prices. That is shipping costs. That is the price of everything that gets transported, which is nearly everything you buy. Economists are already warning that if this disruption continues for another month, the ripple effects on the global economy could be severe. Inflation, supply chain disruptions, energy shortages in parts of Europe and Asia that depend heavily on Gulf oil. Trump on Monday made clear he knows this. He pushed allies, directly, publicly, with unmistakable pressure, to send warships to the region to help escort tankers through the strait. He said numerous countries had told him they were on the way. He would not name them. But he made one thing crystal clear to anyone who was listening. We will remember. Those 3 words, directed at every ally who has benefited from decades of American military protection and is now, in Trump's view, slow to reciprocate. We will remember. That is not diplomatic language. That is a warning. So who is stepping up? Trump mentioned France. He said he had spoken with President Macron and rated his response, and this is pure Trump, an 8, not perfect. He added that he believed Macron would help and that Britain would likely be involved as well. But his frustration with other allies was barely concealed. He talked about countries that have received American protection for years, countries whose security, whose shipping lanes, whose economic prosperity has been underwritten in large part by the presence of the U.S. military, and said some of them were not being as enthusiastic as he expected. This is a recurring tension in American foreign policy that goes back decades. Burden sharing. Who pays? Who sends ships? Who risks their sailors and their political capital? Trump has always made this personal. He does not speak in the language of treaties and multilateral frameworks. He speaks in the language of loyalty, of deals, of reciprocity. And Monday's message was unmistakable. The bill is coming due. If you want American protection going forward, you need to show up now. The world is watching. And Washington is keeping score. Here is something that has not gotten nearly enough attention in the headlines coming out of Monday's presser. Kharg Island. Kharg Island is Iran's most critical oil export terminal. It handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports. It is, in economic terms, the beating heart of the Iranian oil industry. Trump said the United States has, quote, literally destroyed everything on Kharg Island, except the oil facilities themselves. He left them standing, deliberately. And then he looked into those cameras and said those facilities could be destroyed on 5 minutes' notice. 5 minutes. That is not a military briefing. That is a message delivered directly to Tehran, to the Gulf states, to every oil trader watching commodity markets, and to every world leader who is currently on the fence about this conflict. The United States is holding Iran's economic lifeline in its hands, and it has chosen so far not to cut it. Whether that restraint continues, whether that 5-minute clock ever starts, may depend on what happens in the coming days and weeks. On whether a deal gets made, on whether Iran's new leadership decides to negotiate or escalate, on decisions being made right now in rooms we will never see. Which brings us to perhaps the most unsettling part of Monday's press conference. A reporter asked Trump about Iran's leadership, specifically about whether there was anyone left in Tehran to negotiate with. And Trump said he did not know whether Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was still alive. Read that again. The President of the United States said he does not know if Iran's supreme leader is alive. This is not a small thing. In any conflict, you need to know who is on the other side of the table. You need to know who has the authority to order a ceasefire, to sign an agreement, to tell their forces to stand down. Without that, you are not negotiating. You are shouting into a void. Trump did say he believes Iran wants to make a deal, that they are looking for a way out. But he acknowledged the fundamental challenge. Nobody knows for certain who speaks for Iran right now. That uncertainty, that fog of war at the highest levels of the enemy's government, is one of the most dangerous conditions that can exist in a conflict of this scale. And then, after all of that, Trump walked into the Kennedy Center. He talked about renovations. He announced a new CEO. He said the building was in very, very bad condition and pledged to make it the finest performing arts facility in the world. I mention this not to make light of the situation, but because the contrast tells you everything about the moment we are living in. A president standing on the steps of a performing arts center minutes after describing the near total destruction of a nation's military, the mining of the world's most critical oil choke point, and the possible death of a foreign leader. This is the world right now. Hold both things in your mind at once, because both of them are real. So where does this go from here? That is the question nobody can fully answer tonight. But here is what we know. The military campaign, by Trump's own account, has been devastating. Iran's conventional military power has been dramatically reduced. The mine-laying ships are gone. Ballistic missile capacity is down 90%. But wars do not end just because one side has been weakened. They end when both sides decide the cost of continuing is greater than the cost of stopping. Iran, whoever is in charge in Tehran right now, has to make that calculation. Can they continue? Do they want to? And what do they have left to fight with? And the United States has to make its own calculation. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is bleeding the global economy. Allies are being pressured. Oil prices are surging. The American public is watching. 7,000 targets, 60% of Gulf oil exports offline, a supreme leader whose status is unknown, a 5-minute warning on Iran's oil facilities. These are the numbers. These are the facts as we know them tonight. This is not a drill. This is not a geopolitical exercise in a textbook. This is happening right now, and the next few days could determine the shape of the Middle East and the global economy for a generation. This is Rechel Meddow News. Stay informed, stay sharp, and we will keep bringing you every update as it comes.